She had no money, no prospects, and no business touching the Duke's estate ledgers. He made that clear. What he didn't know was that she'd already worked it out on the carriage ride over, and was simply waiting for him to catch up. September 1814. The carriage turned through the gates of Ralston Park on a Tuesday morning in the third week of September, when the oaks along the drive had not yet committed to autumn, but were considering it seriously. Charlotte Marsh sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the window, and she did not allow herself to be impressed. She had been impressed by things before. Her father's library at its height had been genuinely impressive. 3,000 volumes, a ladder on wheels, the smell of binding glue and old paper that she had loved without knowing it was something she would one day mourn. She had been impressed by the River Thames at dawn once when she was 11, and her father had taken her to London to see his publisher, and the light had come off the water in a way that seemed designed to undo a person. She had been impressed at 18 by a young man named Peter Aldridge, who had admired her father's work, and had looked at Charlotte as though she were part of it, until the ruin came, and then he had simply looked elsewhere. She had learned after all of that being impressed was a form of wanting, and wanting things you could not keep was a form of damage. So she looked at the drive of Ralston Park, the perfect line of oaks, the grass on either side cut to a precise obedience, the house assembling itself at the end of the avenue like an argument being made deliberately. And she noted it. She did not let it matter. The house was Palladian in the way that only money and several generations of it could produce. Its symmetry was not accidental. The stone had been cleaned recently. There were flowers in urns at the entrance portico that were not quite in season, which meant someone had gone to some effort, which meant the household had standards it maintained even when no one particular was arriving, or it had been told she was coming and had performed accordingly. Charlotte suspected the former. She was a companion. Companions did not warrant urns. She was 24 years old. Her father had died in March. His debts had swallowed the house in May, the library in June, and her last good option in July, when the solicitor had written to say there was nothing remaining, and had been kind enough to add that a Lady Agatha Hale of Ralston Park, Kent, was seeking a reading companion on account of her failing eyesight. He knew Charlotte's situation. He presented this as a solution. Charlotte had written back to Lady Agatha the same afternoon. She had accepted by return post. The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door with the mechanical courtesy of a man who opened carriage doors many times daily and had made a separate peace with his feelings about it. Charlotte stepped down onto the gravel, carrying her own smaller bag. The larger trunk had been sent ahead, and looked up at the house properly for the first time. A woman stood at the top of the steps. She was perhaps 67, with the erect posture of someone who had decided in middle age that the spine was a moral instrument and had not revised the opinion. Her hair was white and dressed neatly. Her eyes, even at this distance, were sharp. She wore a dark wool dress that cost more than Charlotte's entire remaining wardrobe, and she did not look at all like a woman who needed anything read to her. She looked like a woman who had simply decided she would prefer company. "Miss Marsh," said Lady Agatha, when Charlotte had climbed the steps. Her voice was dry and precise, the kind that carried in large rooms without raising its volume. "You are younger than I expected. Come in before the wind gets an opinion." Charlotte followed her inside. The entrance hall was exactly what the exterior had promised. Stone floors, high ceilings, a staircase of pale oak that curved upward with an assurance Charlotte found either admirable or offensive, depending on which way she chose to receive it. A portrait of a man in military dress watched them cross the hall with the fixed expression of all portrait subjects, caught between significance and the long tedium of being stared at for centuries. "My nephew's father," said Lady Agatha without turning, "died in 1803. Sebastian has the look of him about the jaw, which is unfortunate, as his father was obstinate about that particular feature." She paused before a door at the far end of the hall. "You will meet the Duke at dinner. He is inspecting something on the south field this afternoon, which means he will arrive at table with the expression of a man who has been outdoors and considers this sufficient accomplishment. Do not comment on it." "I shall endeavour not to," Charlotte said. Lady Agatha looked at her for a long moment with those sharp eyes. "Your father was Professor Marsh, the classicist." "Yes. I read his work on Thucydides, before his difficulty." A pause of perhaps 2 seconds, which was the precise amount of time Lady Agatha apparently allocated to acknowledging other people's catastrophes. "It was very good." "It was," Charlotte agreed. Something shifted in the older woman's expression. Not quite warmth, but its distant cousin. Your mother was a Halloway, was she not? Of Sussex? Charlotte looked at her steadily. She was. Her father was Sir Edmund Halloway. The name survives him somewhat better than his fortune did. Halloway of Briarfield. Lady Agatha gave a single, satisfied nod, as though a question she had not voiced had received its answer. Come and see your room. Then you may tell me whether you prefer to read in the mornings or the afternoons, and we shall arrange accordingly. The room was on the second floor of the East Wing, which was Lady Agatha's domain and had been for the 12 years she had lived at Ralston Park, since her own husband's death. It was a pleasant room, south-facing, with a window that looked out over the formal garden, and beyond it the edge of the home wood. The furniture was good. The bed was better than anything Charlotte had slept in for the past 18 months. She unpacked her trunk methodically. 3 dresses, none of them what they had been. Her father's copy of Plutarch, which she had kept from the sale because she had been there when the librarian came, and had simply put it in her pocket and walked out with it. And if that was dishonest, it was the only dishonest thing she had done, and she had calculated the weight of it against the weight of having nothing left of him, and found the arithmetic acceptable. A commonplace book half filled with her own handwriting. A small tortoiseshell hairbrush that had been her mother's. She set the Plutarch on the bedside table. She put the commonplace book in the drawer. She sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 1 minute, and was still. Then she went downstairs for dinner. The dining room at Ralston Park was designed for 20, and contained that evening 3. Lady Agatha at one end, Charlotte placed to her left, and the Duke of Ralston at the other end, separated from Charlotte by a length of mahogany table that could have accommodated a moderate treaty negotiation. He was 32 and looked it. Not badly, simply accurately. Dark-haired, with the jaw Lady Agatha had mentioned, set and particular. His face was the kind that would have been called handsome in a ballroom, and was simply functional here, in the candlelight of his own dining room, with the slight distraction of a man who had been outdoors all afternoon and had not entirely returned. He was dressed correctly. He sat correctly. He looked, when he registered Charlotte's presence, precisely as though he had known she was coming, and had formed no particular opinion of it in advance. Miss Marsh, he said, my aunt speaks well of your father's work. She mentioned it, Charlotte said. He would have been gratified. You read Greek? Yes. Something in the Duke's expression adjusted by a degree too small to name. My aunt has been requesting someone who can manage the Thucydides she ordered from London. My own Greek is serviceable at best. I am perfectly capable of managing Thucydides, Charlotte said. I don't doubt it. He picked up his wineglass. He did not say anything else on the subject. The implication was polite and complete. The conversation had been catalogued, acknowledged, and filed. She was the reading companion. He was the Duke. These were the established coordinates, and they would operate within them. Charlotte ate her soup and watched the candles and said nothing further. She was very good at saying nothing further when it was required. After dinner, Lady Agatha kept Charlotte for an hour in the sitting-room off the East Wing, reading aloud from a novel Charlotte found moderately irritating. The heroine suffered too much from her own feelings, while Lady Agatha sat with her eyes closed and occasionally said, "Again, please," when Charlotte's pace grew too efficient for her taste. At 9 o'clock Lady Agatha said, "That will do, you may go, you read well, you don't perform it." My father preferred plain reading. Your father was correct. Lady Agatha's eyes opened. They were still sharp even at this hour. Sebastian is a good man, Miss Marsh. I say this without prejudice, only as a fact you may find useful. He is not his father's jaw. Charlotte thought about this all the way up the stairs. She had been at Ralston Park for 9 days when she found the first irregularity. It was a Wednesday morning in the last week of September, and Lady Agatha had asked Charlotte to read from the estate correspondence. 2 tenants had written about fence repairs and drainage respectively, and Lady Agatha liked to remain informed of the estate's business, on the grounds that she had lived at Ralston longer than her nephew, who had only inherited the thing, whereas she had watched it across 3 decades, and felt therefore entitled to an opinion. Charlotte read the letters. She read the summaries of the quarterly accounts that had been set aside with them, which Lady Agatha had also requested, and which Charlotte now read aloud in the steady, efficient voice she used for anything that was not literature. She paused at a figure. "What is it?" said Lady Agatha, eyes still closed. "The accounts show a quarterly disbursement to the Northfield Drainage Project," Charlotte said, "of £214, paid in August. But the August maintenance log, which you have here from last month—" She shifted one paper. records the drainage work as completed in June at a total cost of £187, already paid. A silence. There are 2 payments recorded, Charlotte continued, for the same project on separate ledger lines. The second is described as a completion payment, but the completion was recorded in June. Lady Agatha opened her eyes. It is possible, Charlotte said, measuring her words, that I am reading this incorrectly. I am not familiar with estate accounting practices. You are reading it correctly, said Lady Agatha. She was quiet for a moment. Bring those papers to my nephew. Shall I mark the relevant lines? I imagine you already have. Charlotte had. She found the Duke in his study at 10:30, where he was working through his own papers with the concentrated expression of a man who preferred to deal with things directly and had an estate large enough to provide an endless supply of things. He looked up when Charlotte appeared in the doorway. Miss Marsh. I apologize for the interruption, Your Grace. She came forward and placed the papers on his desk, the relevant lines marked in pencil, her own small notation in the margin. Lady Agatha asked me to bring these to you. There appear to be 2 disbursements recorded for the North Drainage Project, one in June, which corresponds to the completed works log, and one in August, which does not. I may have misread the system. He took the papers, he read them. Charlotte stood and waited, which she was accustomed to doing and did without discomfort. The August entry is annotated by Dowell, Sebastian said, half to himself. He leaned back slightly. He handles the accounts. There's likely an explanation, retention payment perhaps. It isn't uncommon for larger projects to carry a final payment after inspection. He set the papers down and looked at her with the brisk, polite expression of a man closing a matter. I'll speak to him. Of course, Charlotte said. Thank you for bringing it. She left. On the way back down the corridor she thought he had not asked her what she thought the explanation was. He had supplied one himself. It was possible that he was correct. She turned it over during the whole walk back to Lady Agatha's sitting room, and by the time she arrived, she had a very clear picture of what she thought, and none of it resembled a retention payment. She sat down and resumed reading from the Thucydides. October 1814. The library at Ralston Park was on the ground floor of the south wing, and it was, Charlotte admitted to herself on the first morning, she was allowed unrestricted use of it, impressive. She let herself be impressed. She was alone. 4,000 volumes, perhaps. Better organized than her father's had been, which was less a compliment to the Duke than an acknowledgement that he could afford someone to do the organizing. There was a reading table by the window, large enough that a person could spread papers across it without losing any of the smaller ones, and 2 chairs by the fireplace that had been chosen for comfort rather than appearance, which told Charlotte something about who actually used this room. Sebastian used it. She had found 3 books left open, one marked with a letter as a page holder, one face down in a way that would damage the spine, and she had noted them all and reshelved nothing. She was there on the 5th of October when he walked in. He stopped when he saw her. She looked up from the Plutarch she had permitted herself after finishing the Thucydides Lady Agatha had wanted. Outside, a rain that had been threatening since morning finally arrived, and the windows became irrelevant. Miss Marsh. He moved to the writing table, which was at the other end of the room from where she sat. I didn't expect anyone. I can leave, she said. No, read. He pulled out the chair, opened a ledger, and began to write. Charlotte looked back at her Plutarch. For perhaps 20 minutes there was no sound in the room except the rain and the scratch of his pen, which was a working sound and not an uncomfortable one. Then he said without looking up, Dowell's explanation for the August entry was a subcontractor payment. An invoice had been delayed. Charlotte kept her eyes on the page. I see. Does that satisfy your concern? She looked up. He was watching her now, pen still in hand. His expression was attentive in a way it had not been at dinner, the way a person looked when they were genuinely asking rather than simply speaking. It addresses the August entry, she said carefully. Yes, but... A pause. She had not said, but... You have a further concern, he said. She did. She had in fact 3. But she was not certain how they would be received, and she had learned, from her father's study, from Peter Aldridge, from the solicitor who had been kind enough to find her this position but had not asked her opinion of the will, that there was a particular cost to being a woman with a further concern, and she preferred to be precise about when she was willing to pay it. The subcontractor invoice, she said. If Lady Agatha has it on file, I would be able to compare it to the quarterly accounts, simply to close the question. Sebastian was quiet for a moment. I've closed the question. "Of course," she said. He went back to the ledger. She went back to the Plutarch. She did not say what she thought about closed questions. The rain grew heavier against the glass. After a few minutes, the Duke said without ceremony, "Which Plutarch is that?" "The Parallel Lives, Alcibiades and Coriolanus." "Why those two?" "My father used to say they were the best argument against the idea that brilliance excuses character." She turned a page. He was right, as it turned out. Sebastian did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was slightly different, not softer but less formal. "A lesson with more than one application." "Several," Charlotte agreed. They developed, without either of them deciding to, a habit of the library. It was not deliberate. The library was simply the room in the house where it was possible to be occupied and quiet simultaneously, and both of them valued this. Lady Agatha napped in the afternoons. The weather in October in Kent is not the weather of a social county, and the Ralston Park grounds, however well kept, did not reward long walks in grey rain. And so they were, on perhaps 4 afternoons out of 7, in the same room. He read dispatches from the London Steward. He worked on estate correspondence. Once Charlotte looked up and found him simply staring at the middle distance with an expression she recognized from her father's worst years. Not despondency, but the particular exhaustion of a man who had been responsible for something large for a long time, without anyone to share the weight. She looked back at her book and said nothing. It was not her place to say anything, but she noted it. He had a habit of asking what she was reading, not in the polite way of drawing-room conversation, where the question meant nothing, and the answer was immediately forgotten. He asked as though the answer were information he intended to use. And when she told him, Plutarch, or a tract on Roman land reform she had found on the top shelf that no one appeared to have opened since 1796, he would pause his own work and ask one precise question, and she would answer it, and he would nod and return to the ledger. On the 12th of October, Lady Agatha's neighbour, Mrs. Hargreaves, called with her daughter. The daughter, Miss Isabel Hargreaves, was 19 and very pretty and entirely delightful in the way of young women who have not yet discovered that they are expected to be less than entirely delightful. She talked about the upcoming Ashford Assembly with a warmth that Charlotte found she did not begrudge at all, and which Lady Agatha tolerated with the grace of a woman who had once been young and had been paying the debt ever since. Sebastian was present for the call. He was polite, attentive, and gave every appearance of a man performing social duty well. Mrs. Hargreaves angled her daughter toward him with the subtle skill of someone who had been doing this for 2 seasons and had not yet given up hope. Charlotte sat with her tea and watched, and the only thing she noticed, which she did not allow to mean anything, was that he looked across the room at her twice during the conversation. Not in any significant way. Simply looked, as people do when they are bored and their eyes require somewhere else to go. She made no inventory of it whatsoever. On the 14th of October, Charlotte found the second irregularity. Lady Agatha had asked her to locate a particular letter from the estate's timber merchant, dated the previous spring, as there was some question about a clause in the contract. Charlotte went to the estate correspondence files, which were kept in the cabinet outside Mr. Dowell's office. Dowell himself was away that afternoon, visiting a supplier in Maidstone, and she found the timber merchant's letter without difficulty. She also found, filed adjacent to it, a contract for a water rights sublease. A portion of the stream running along the eastern boundary had been subleased to the Pembury Mill in the neighbouring parish. The terms were straightforward: £180 per year, paid quarterly at £45 per quarter over a 15-month term. The lease had been signed 6 months ago, in April, under Dowell's general management authority. Charlotte looked at the figure. £180 per year. 3 quarterly payments should therefore have been received, April, July and the October payment now overdue, totalling £135 in hand, with £45 outstanding. She opened the estate accounts for the summer and autumn quarters. She went through them methodically, column by column. £135 was not there, no portion of it was there. No line described the Pembury Mill, no line described water rights. The lease existed, the payments, by all evidence, did not. Charlotte stood at the cabinet for a long moment. £135 had been received for the water rights lease and had not entered the estate accounts. She looked at the quarterly figure again, £45. She thought about the drainage duplication from August. £214 recorded, £187 paid, a false surplus of £27 on that entry alone. She thought about the subcontractor explanation Sebastian had accepted, She thought about the word practiced. She carried the timber merchant's letter to Lady Agatha, delivered it, answered Lady Agatha's questions about it, and said nothing about the lease. Then she went to the library. He was there, which was fortunate, and he was alone, which was more so. "I need to show you something," she said. She said it plainly, without preamble, without apology, and without the softening inflection she usually employed when approaching a topic that was not her domain. She had run out of patience for softening inflections. The pattern was too clear. Sebastian looked up from the dispatch he was reading. Her face apparently communicated something, because he set the dispatch down immediately. She placed the lease on the table beside him, folded open to the payment schedule, and put her finger on the quarterly figure. "The water rights lease to the Pembury Mill," she said. "Signed 6 months ago in April. £180 per year, payable quarterly at £45. 3 quarterly payments, April, July, and the present October, should have entered the accounts. They have not. £135 is missing." He looked at the lease. He looked at the accounts she had also brought. He read them. He was not a slow reader. His eyes moved efficiently across the figures, and he was quiet for a moment. That was longer than his usual quiet. "How did you find this?" he said. "I was looking for a letter from the timber merchant. This was filed beside it." He read the lease again. "I'll look into this with Dowell." "Yes," she said. "You were correct to bring it." She waited. He seemed to expect something further from her, or possibly he simply continued to look at her because she was standing directly in front of him, which was the more reasonable explanation, and she was not going to read significance into it. "What is your account of it?" he asked. The question surprised her, because she had not expected him to ask it. He had not asked it the first time, he was asking it now. "I have a theory," she said carefully. "I would prefer one more piece of information before I state it fully." "What piece?" "Whether Mr. Dowell has any personal financial obligation that arose approximately 7 years ago. A debt, or a series of them." She paused. "The drainage duplication is a practiced entry. Whoever made it has been doing something of this kind for some time. The water rights lease is newer. The method is the same, but the vehicle is different, which suggests the original amounts were no longer sufficient." Sebastian was very still. "You think it began 7 years ago?" "I think it began at a moment of desperation," she said, "and has been compounding ever since." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You may not be wrong." Charlotte picked up the papers. "I'll return these to the files." "Leave them." His voice was quiet and not unkind. "Please." She left them. She sat in her chair by the fire, opened the Plutarch and read. He sat at the table with the papers in front of him and was motionless for several minutes, and when he finally moved again it was to take out a fresh sheet of paper and begin to write. 3 days later, Sebastian told her that he had reviewed Dowell's accounts and found nothing. He said it in the hallway outside Lady Agatha's sitting room, briefly and without particular weight, the way a man conveys a conclusion he has reached to someone who raised a question that turned out to be less pressing than it appeared. Charlotte said, "I see, thank you for telling me." She said it looking at him directly, which was the most she permitted herself. He clearly read something in that look, something worth examining, because he said, "You don't agree." "I don't have the information to agree or disagree. I haven't seen the personal accounts." "I reviewed them thoroughly." "I'm sure you did." A pause. "You are quite remarkably careful with how you say things," he said. There was something in his voice that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it. "I found it useful," Charlotte said. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Then, "Come to the study after dinner. I'll show you the accounts." She did not let her face change. "Thank you, Your Grace." He showed her the accounts. They sat on opposite sides of the writing table, the ledgers open between them, and she went through the columns with the systematic attention of her father's daughter, which was to say, she did not skip, she did not assume, she did not accept totals without checking the arithmetic behind them. She found it in 40 minutes. It was not in the personal accounts. It was in the household accounts for the dower wing, a small secondary ledger kept for Lady Agatha's domestic expenses, technically under the estate steward's management, but reviewed by no one closely, because it concerned candles and laundry and the unremarkable upkeep of an elderly widow's rooms. Buried in the dower wing accounts, described as a quarterly fuel delivery, was a payment of £45 to an address in Rochester. "Rochester," Charlotte said. Sebastian leaned over to look. His shoulder was 2 inches from hers. She did not move back. "That's not a fuel supplier's address." "No," she said. £45 per quarter, £180 per year. She set her finger on the Pembury Mill lease figure beside it. The same number. He sat back. In the candlelight his expression was controlled and careful. He is routing the lease income directly to a creditor. Yes. Charlotte turned one more page, and has been doing so since April when the lease was signed, but the entries in the dower wing accounts predate the lease by several years. The fuel delivery notation has appeared quarterly since 1810, at smaller figures, increasing each year. Sebastian studied the columns. His jaw was the set, particular thing Lady Agatha had described. His wife died in 1810, Charlotte said. I believe she was ill for 3 years before that, from 1807. I believe he borrowed money to pay for her care, and the lender's rates compounded after her death, and the original debt of, she gestured at the earliest entry, perhaps £40 or £50 became something that required £180 a year to service by 1814. A silence. The fire shifted. You have constructed this from the ledger, Sebastian said. Not a question. From the ledger and from recognition, she said. She looked at the figures rather than at him. My father's ruin followed the same arithmetic. A first debt, reasonable in context, a second to cover it, a third to cover the interest. By the time anyone looked properly, the original sum was invisible beneath what it had grown into. She paused. I recognized the shape of it. Sebastian said nothing for a long moment. Miss Marsh, he said. Yes. I dismissed your first observation about the drainage accounts. I was wrong to. She looked at him. He was watching her with the direct, honest expression of a man who had made a calculation and arrived at an uncomfortable sum, and who was not attempting to soften it for anyone's benefit, including his own. You were working from incomplete information, she said. I was working from an assumption. A pause. That is different. Late October 1814. On the 21st of October, a party of neighbours came to Ralston Park for dinner. This had been arranged by Lady Agatha before Charlotte's arrival and constituted, in the social calendar of that corner of Kent, a significant occasion. The Hargreaves came, Sir Robert Fenwick and his wife came, Mr. Lawton, who was the Duke's London solicitor, and happened to be in the county on an unrelated matter, came because Lady Agatha had decided it was convenient. His ward, a young man of 20 called Gerald Fenwick, came because he had nowhere else to be, and a good appetite. Charlotte dressed in her second-best dress, which was also her best dress by virtue of the best dress having developed an irreparable difficulty at the cuff. She did her own hair. She went downstairs. She was, as she had been at every Ralston Park gathering, the reading companion. She ate at the table. Lady Agatha had been firm about this, and she was included in the conversation when the topic demanded it, and she said intelligent things when asked, and did not volunteer opinions when they were not wanted. She did not find this degrading. She had made her peace with it. She understood the coordinates. What she found, rather, was that the coordinates were not entirely fixed tonight, because Sebastian kept addressing her directly across the table on the subject of Roman land reform, a direct consequence of their library conversations, which he either had not considered or had considered and proceeded anyway, and the other guests were making small recalibrations in their understanding of who, precisely, Charlotte Marsh was. Mrs. Hargreaves, seated 2 chairs from Charlotte, asked where she had been educated. My father educated me, Charlotte said. Professor Marsh was a considerable scholar, said Mr. Lawton from further down the table, with the authority of a man who read reviews in the right publications. His Thucydides was reviewed in the Edinburgh. He would have been pleased to hear it, Charlotte said. And your mother's family. I believe there are Halloways in the county. My grandfather was Sir Edmund Halloway of Briarfield. Charlotte kept her voice entirely even. The estate passed from the family some years ago, but the connection is remembered in certain circles, I am told. Lawton nodded, reassessing something quietly. Mrs. Hargreaves re-examined Charlotte with a fractionally different expression, the specific recalibration of a woman who has established that another woman is poor but not common, which in the social logic of Kent in 1814 was a distinction of considerable weight. You have continued your father's scholarship, Mr. Lawton asked. I have continued reading, Charlotte said. Scholarship requires rather more institutional support than I presently command. A small silence, politely absorbed. Charlotte had stated it without apology, which was the only way she knew how to state things that were true, and she watched the table receive it. Sebastian at the head was looking at her with an expression she had begun to learn. It was not a simple expression. It was the expression of a man who was paying close attention and had not, until recently, been in the habit of doing so. After the cloth was drawn and the party moved to the drawing room, Mr. Lawton came to stand beside Charlotte. With a glass of wine he did not appear to be drinking, and he said, in the low, professional tone of someone raising a subject carefully, "I heard, obliquely, that there may be some irregularity in the estate accounts." Charlotte looked at him. "That is a matter for his grace." "Naturally. I raise it only because Dowell has served the estate for over 2 decades, and if there is any question of, well, I would not like to see a good man ruined on a misreading." "Nor would I," Charlotte said. "And you have been involved in the examination?" "I notice things," she said. "It is a habit I have not managed to break." Lawton looked at her for a moment, with the measured eyes of a man paid to read people. "Your father would have been satisfied," he said eventually. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was both true and appropriate, and she had learned to leave a silence as a kind of answer. Across the room, Sebastian was speaking with Sir Robert Fenwick. Charlotte watched, from the side of her eye only, and she saw the moment when his attention became elsewhere. Not on Sir Robert, not on the fireplace. On her. She turned away. The drawing room was warm and the evening was well advanced. At a little past 8 o'clock, Charlotte stepped into the hallway to retrieve a shawl she had left at the coat stand. The fire had been generous, and she had not thought she would want it, and had been wrong, as the draughts in the Ralston Park hallways were indifferent to drawing-room temperatures. Sebastian was there. He had left the drawing-room perhaps 3 minutes before her, which she had noted, which was not a habit she had intended to develop. The hallway was lit by 2 wall sconces, warm and particular, and it was, for a moment, very quiet, the drawing-room muffled behind its closed door. The house settled around them. A footman passed at the far end of the corridor, carrying a tea tray toward the drawing-room. He did not look at them. He turned the corner. The hallway was quiet again. "Mr. Lawton spoke to you," Sebastian said. "Yes." "What did he say?" "He expressed concern for Dowell," she said, "and some curiosity about my role in the matter." Sebastian was silent for a moment. He had his hands clasped behind his back, which she had learned was his version of controlled. "What did you tell him?" "That it was a matter for you." She took the shawl from the stand. "That I notice things." "You do," he said. She looked at him. The candlelight was honest, and he had not attempted to compose his expression for it. He looked like a man who had been rearranging something in his understanding, and had not quite finished. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for the drainage accounts. I made an assumption about the nature of your observation rather than examining it. That was careless." "It was understandable," she said. "That isn't the same as acceptable." She was quiet. From the drawing-room, the distant sound of conversation, someone's laughter, the ordinary texture of an evening that was continuing without them. "You have been," he said, and paused, selecting the word with some care, "essential to this investigation. I would have reached the wrong conclusion without you." Charlotte felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately name. She looked at the floor, then back at him. "I would have reached it faster with access to Dowell's personal records from the beginning." He accepted this without flinching. "Yes, you would have." She put the shawl around her shoulders. She found she could not quite make herself move toward the drawing-room door. He had not moved either. "Why did you stay?" he asked quietly, not meaning the hallway. She understood the question. "Lady Agatha is kind, the library is good, and I had not finished working out the problem." "The accounts." "Among other things," she said. The pause was longer than any pause between them had previously lasted. "Miss Marsh," he said. "Yes." He did not immediately continue. He looked at her with the attentive, careful expression she had originally read as the expression of a man who was used to being correct and was revising something. She had since understood it more clearly. It was the expression of a man who was paying attention to something he was afraid to want. "Come and speak to me tomorrow," he said, "in the study about Dowell. I believe I now have what I need to act, and I would like your account of it before I do." "You know my account," she said. "You've known it for 10 days. "I know," he said. "I would like to hear it said properly." She went back to the drawing-room. She was quite certain, for the first time, of something she had been cataloguing for 3 weeks. She did not permit herself to feel it fully, but she acknowledged it, with the same precision she brought to everything. She was falling in love with the Duke of Ralston, and it was inconvenient, and it had almost certainly been inevitable since the afternoon in the library, when he had asked what she thought and meant it. She was in the study at 9 the next morning before he arrived, which was the only way she operated. He found her at the writing table with the full set of accounts spread before her. She had spent the previous evening, after the guests had gone, after Lady Agatha had been settled in the 2 hours before she slept, compiling everything into a single document. 3 pages in her neat, exact handwriting. The complete pattern, the drainage duplication, the water rights lease, the Dower Wing fuel payments, the timeline from 1807, the Rochester address, the methodology. The figures checked twice, the arithmetic in the margin. She had titled it, Account of the Irregularities in the Ralston Park Estate Accounts, October 1814, which was not a romantic title but was an accurate one. She pushed it toward him when he sat down. He read it in silence. He read it twice. When he looked up, she was watching him, and she did not look away because she had decided, in those 2 hours the previous night, that the era of looking away was over. "You wrote this last night," he said. "Yes." "After the dinner party?" "Yes." He set the document down. He looked at her for a long moment, not the polite, managing look of a duke examining his aunt's companion, the look of a man who was seeing someone. "I'm going to confront Dowell today," he said. "I would like you to be present." She had not expected this. "He needs to understand," Sebastian said, "that the account of this was not mine alone. He needs to know who found it." "He may resent it," Charlotte said. "He may." His voice was quiet. "I think he will be rather more occupied with his own situation to have strong feelings about the source. Why do you want me there?" He took a moment. "Because you found it. Because the account is yours as much as mine. And because—" He stopped. He looked at the papers. "I have been in the habit of accepting conclusions without examining the reasoning behind them. I would like to practice a different habit." Charlotte looked at him. She thought, "You are not a bad man. You have simply never been in a room with someone who would tell you differently." She said, "I'll be there." They confronted Dowell at 11 o'clock in the estate steward's office, a room of filing cabinets and ledgers, and the smell of old paper that was not like her father's library at all, but which reminded her of it anyway. Dowell was 58, with a face that had been handsome once and was now only tired. He looked at the papers Sebastian placed before him with the expression Charlotte had been waiting to see. Not anger, not denial, but the long, exhausted relief of a man who has been carrying something too heavy for too long. His wife, it turned out. 3 years of a wasting illness from 1807 to 1810, a doctor he could not afford and could not stop paying, because stopping would have meant accepting what he was not yet prepared to accept. A moneylender in Rochester, recommended by a desperate colleague, whose initial rate had seemed survivable, and whose compounding interest had not. "She died in the spring of 1810, he said. He said it to the table. The debt did not die with her. The lender increased the rate after she was gone. I had nothing left to sell. The diversions had begun in 1810, he admitted, small sums carefully placed where no one looked. The drainage duplication had been the most recent method, cleaner than earlier attempts. The Pembury Mill lease had been an opportunity he had not been able to refuse, a legitimate payment that he could route in its entirety to Rochester before it ever appeared in the estate books. Sebastian listened. Charlotte listened. The room was quiet. "You will repay the estate," Sebastian said when Dowell had finished. "The full amount with interest over a period we will arrange through Mr. Lawton. There will be no prosecution, provided the repayment proceeds and you resign the position at the end of the month." Dowell looked up. He had not expected those words in that order. "There is a pension," Sebastian added. "My father instituted it for long service. It stands." Dowell said nothing for a long moment, then simply, "Thank you, Your Grace." He did not look at Charlotte, but he was aware of her. She could see it in the precise angle of his not looking. After Dowell had gone, Sebastian and Charlotte stood in the hallway outside the estate office, and for the first time in their entire acquaintance, she did not know what to say. He looked at her. She looked at him. The estate was quiet around them, the sounds of the house, the distant work of the kitchen, a horse somewhere in the yard, the ordinary sounds of a place that continued. "So you are thinking something," he said. "I usually am," she said. "Tell me." She looked at the window at the far end of the corridor, where the October light came in flat and grey and honest. "I am thinking that it is possible to be wrong about something for so long that you forget you decided to believe it, and that the deciding was the problem, not the information." He was quiet. "It's not about the accounts," she said. "I know," he said. She looked back at him. His expression had shifted from the careful control she recognized into something she had not seen before, something that was not performing itself for anyone's benefit, something plain. "Charlotte," he said. And it was the first time he had used her name, and it was very quiet and very deliberate, and she felt it precisely as she knew he intended it. She did not answer. She looked at him and waited, not the waiting of someone who expected to be dismissed, but the waiting of someone who had decided to stay. He took one step toward her. And then the door at the end of the corridor opened, and Dowell's clerk came through it with an armful of ledgers that needed to be returned to the cabinet, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary, as moments do. But it had been, and they both knew it had been. Late October, early November 1814. The gathering that Mr. Lawton had proposed, a dinner at Sir Robert Fenwick's house in the neighbouring village, took place on the 28th of October, and Charlotte did not intend it to become the scene it became. She had dressed carefully, which she told herself was habit and not hope, and she had sat through the soup and the fish course with the composed attentiveness of a woman who has learned that listening is a kind of power. There were 8 at the table: Sir Robert and his wife, the Hargreaves' mother and daughter, Mr. Lawton and Mr. Aldous, who was a minor landowner from the adjacent parish, Lady Agatha, and Sebastian. Charlotte was seated between Lady Agatha and Mr. Aldous, which was where companions were seated. Mr. Aldous was pleasant and spoke at length about turnips, and Charlotte gave him the portion of her attention that turnips required and reserved the remainder. She had spent 3 days since the confrontation with Dowell in a state of careful suspension. Sebastian had been formal with her, not cold, but correct, the way a man is correct when he is managing something he has not yet decided how to hold. In the library their afternoons had continued, but something had shifted in the quality of the silence. She had been aware of him in a way that made the Plutarch rather difficult, which was an unprecedented insult to Plutarch, and she felt it appropriately. He had said her name. She had not stopped thinking about it. The dinner conversation moved, as it generally did in that county, through crops and weather and the London news, and then, because Lawton was a lawyer by temperament even in social settings, toward the matter of the Ralston estate. "I hear there has been some rearrangement in the stewardship," said Sir Robert, with the carefully neutral interest of a neighbour who has heard something and is waiting for official confirmation. "Dowell has retired," Sebastian said. He said it with the even informative tone of a man who has prepared for this question. It was time. "Long service," said Mr. Lawton. 23 years, wasn't it?" "It was." "Good man," said Sir Robert, in the tone of a man who has done business with someone and found it satisfactory. "No difficulty, I hope." There was a pause, the length of a breath, the space between one thing and another. Charlotte looked at her plate. She had not looked at Sebastian. She did not need to. "There was a difficulty," Sebastian said. "It has been resolved." Mrs. Hargreaves looked up with the social instincts of a woman who had attended 30 years of dinners and had developed a precise ear for the pause before a disclosure. "Oh?" "Some irregularities in the accounts," Sebastian said. "Several years' worth, it turned out, not discovered by me." The table was listening now. Mr. Aldous had abandoned the turnips entirely. The irregularities were identified by Miss Marsh. Sebastian looked directly at Charlotte for the first time since the soup, not in the polite, managing way, directly. "She found the first discrepancy in the drainage accounts 3 weeks ago and brought it to my attention. I dismissed it as a likely administrative error." He said the next sentence without emphasis, which gave it more weight than emphasis would have. "I was wrong. She was right." She continued to investigate, through the estate files, the lease records, the secondary household accounts, and constructed a complete account of the fraud before I had found the first half of it. The table was quiet. "The full matter has been settled," he continued, "at considerable saving to the estate, which is a saving I owe entirely to Miss Marsh's attention and her persistence in raising what I had preferred to close." Charlotte looked at him. She had prepared herself during the carriage ride over for a public moment. She had done what she always did on carriage rides, which was to think ahead of the arriving, and she had understood that something of this sort might occur, because she knew him now well enough to know that he had been moving toward it. She had not, however, prepared herself for the precision of it. He had not said she helped. He had not said she noticed something useful. He had said, "She was right, I was wrong, and the saving is owed to her," in front of Lawton, who would carry it to London, in front of Sir Robert, who would carry it to the county, in front of Mrs. Hargreaves, who would carry it directly to everyone she had ever met before the week was out. Lady Agatha, beside Charlotte, said nothing. She picked up her wine-glass, This was Lady Agatha's way of applauding. "Well," said Mr. Lawton, with the equanimity of a man who had suspected something of the sort. He looked at Charlotte with recalibrated respect. Professor Marsh's daughter, indeed. "His methods were useful," Charlotte said. Her voice came out steady, which was more than she had guaranteed herself. "He believed that the function of a trained mind was to look where other minds had not thought to look. I have not found a better approach." "You'll need a new steward," said Sir Robert to Sebastian, with the practical instinct of a man who processes information and moves immediately to the next problem. "I am in discussions," Sebastian said. He had not looked away from Charlotte. "Several matters require re-examining." Charlotte held his gaze for one full second. Then she looked at her plate, because she needed somewhere to put what she felt, and the plate was available. The party broke up at 10:30. The carriages were called. Lady Agatha had developed a headache with suspiciously precise timing. It had arrived shortly after Sebastian's speech and before the dessert was cleared, and had asked Charlotte to see to her wraps and her carriage arrangements, which Charlotte did, and which resulted in Lady Agatha departing in the first carriage with Mrs. Hargreaves, who lived in the same direction and with whom she was apparently very comfortable, despite having shown no previous signs of finding Mrs. Hargreaves particularly restful. This left Charlotte at the door of the Fenwick house, waiting for the second Ralston carriage with Sebastian. They were alone. The night was cold and clear, and the November stars were very precise overhead, and the gravel was crunching under the feet of the remaining footmen organizing horses. "You didn't have to do that," Charlotte said. "I know," he said. "It will be talked about." "Yes." He looked out at the drive. Lawton was already composing the letter to London before the fish course was cleared. He is constitutionally incapable of knowing something significant and keeping it. "They'll say you were taken in by a pretty face and a pair of spectacles," she said. She said it without bitterness, because it was simply the truth of how such things were discussed. "Some will." He turned to look at her. "They'll be wrong, and they'll know they're wrong, because Lawton will tell the story correctly, and Lawton's version of correct is exhaustingly precise." A pause. "Let them say what they like." The carriage arrived. The footman came to the door. Charlotte did not move. "You used my name," she said quietly, 3 days ago in the corridor." "I did." "You haven't used it since?" "No." He looked at her with a careful, open expression that meant he had decided to say something, as opposed to something that had merely occurred to him. "I wasn't certain how it would be received." "And now?" "I am somewhat more certain," he said. She looked at him for a long moment in the cold. "Charlotte," she said. Not a question, simply the word returned. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Will you get in the carriage, Charlotte?" She got in the carriage. He got in after her. The footman shut the door, the carriage moved. They sat across from each other in the relative dark, the small interior lamp swinging slightly with the motion of the wheels, and in its light she could see him clearly enough. He was watching her with the full attention of a man who had finally allowed himself to look. "I have been managing myself very poorly for 3 weeks, he said conversationally. "I noticed," she said. "I imagine you did." A pause. "I would like to stop managing myself poorly if you are in agreement." "What would that look like?" she asked. She kept her voice even. It required some effort. "It would look," he said, "like me telling you that I have thought of very little else since I first watched you go through an estate ledger with an expression of absolute concentration and find in 40 minutes what I had overlooked for 3 years." He paused. "And since the Plutarch, and since you told me about your father's arithmetic." Charlotte looked at the lamp. She looked at her hands. She looked at him. "I have been aware," she said carefully, "of a development in my own thinking, for some time, which I have not permitted myself to pursue, for reasons that will be obvious." "Name them," he said. "I were the Duke of Ralston. I am the companion to your aunt. The social coordinates they are not designed to accommodate." She stopped. She began again. "I don't know what you are offering." "I am offering," he said very quietly, "the opportunity to speak plainly to each other, in a carriage for the 7 minutes it takes to return to Ralston Park, and then to see what follows." "And what do you believe follows?" she asked. He looked at her. "I believe I would like to marry you," he said, "if you can be persuaded to consider it." The carriage jolted slightly on the lane. The lamp swung. Charlotte sat very still. "You have known me for 6 weeks," she said. "I have," he said. "I have also in those 6 weeks spoken more honestly with you than with anyone in the previous 6 years. That may not be a recommendation of my previous 6 years, but I consider it a fair account of what you are." She was quiet. "I am not asking you to answer now," he said. He looked at his hands, then back at her. "I am simply asking you to know that it is what I want, and that the social coordinates, I am aware of them. I am the Duke. I can rearrange the coordinates." Charlotte thought about this for the remaining 4 minutes of the carriage ride, which was not sufficient time to think about it properly, but was sufficient to arrive at the following: that she had survived the ruin of her father's house, the dissolution of every prospect she had been raised to expect, and 18 months of being tolerated in other people's spaces on the strength of her own judgment. Her judgment now was unambiguous. It had been unambiguous for 3 weeks. She had simply been waiting to see whether his would come to the same place. It had. The carriage stopped, the door opened. She stood, and before she stepped down, she looked at him one final time in the small swinging lamplight. "Ask me again," she said, "in the morning, when we are not in a carriage." "I will," he said. She went inside. He asked her in the morning. He found her in the library at 8:30, which was the earliest she had ever been there, and she had been there since 7:30, which was the detail she chose not to mention. He walked in, and she looked up, and he said, "I asked you last night, and I am asking again, will you marry me, Charlotte? Harry?" She closed the Plutarch. She stood up. She walked to the center of the room, which put her 6 feet from him, and she said, "Yes." He crossed the remaining 6 feet. He took her face in both hands, carefully, like a man who had been thinking about this for some weeks and intended to do it correctly, and he kissed her. It was not a complicated kiss. It was the kind that meant something has been decided, and the deciding is done, and what remains is simply the thing itself. She put her hand against his chest and felt the solid fact of him. He smelled of cold morning air and wool and something that was his own, specific, and would be hers to know. When he lifted his head, they were both very still. "You worked it out on the carriage ride," he said. "It was not a question." "Last night's," she said. "Yes." "Not the one from September?" She looked at him. "I worked something out on that one too," she said, "but it wasn't the same question." He laughed, a real laugh, not a social one, a laugh that came from somewhere genuine, and she felt it against her palm. Lady Agatha found them still in the library 40 minutes later. She stood in the doorway and assessed the situation with the comprehensive clarity of a woman who had expected something of the sort for the better part of a month. "Well," she said. "Aunt Agatha," Sebastian said, "I shall need a new companion." Lady Agatha addressed this observation to the fireplace. "If she is to be the Duchess, she cannot very well also be my reader. It would be confusing for the staff." She turned and began to leave. At the doorway she paused. "Professor Marsh would have been satisfied," she said to Charlotte specifically, and then she was gone. Charlotte stood in the library that had been for 6 weeks her best thing, and looked at the man she was going to marry, and felt something she had not allowed herself in 18 months, the certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They were engaged 3 days later, formally, with a letter to Charlotte's one remaining living relative, an uncle in Exeter who received the news with bewildered gratitude, and a notice dispatched to London, where it would find its way to Lawton before the ink was dry. The notice caused, as Sebastian had predicted, a certain amount of discussion. The ton had opinions. Several of them were aired in drawing rooms, in letters, in the quiet devastation of morning calls. A Duke of Ralston marrying his aunt's reading companion was not the sort of thing that passed without comment, and Charlotte did not expect it to. What the comment could not dispute, and what Lawton's exhaustingly precise account had ensured was widely understood, was that Charlotte Marsh was a Halloway of Sussex on her mother's side, a gentleman's daughter on her father's, and the woman who had saved the Ralston estate from a fraud its duke had not detected. The ton could object to the match on grounds of fortune. It could not object on grounds of blood. And it could not, without embarrassing itself, object on grounds of capability. Lady Agatha received 3 letters in the first week, expressing varying degrees of concern for the family's reputation. She replied to none of them. This was, Charlotte learned, also Lady Agatha's way of applauding. They married in December. The church was the village church in the parish below the estate, because Lady Agatha had said she had never seen the point of a cathedral except for acoustics, and Charlotte said she agreed entirely, and Sebastian said he was content to be married in a field if it suited them, which was the sort of thing that made Charlotte look at him with an expression she no longer bothered to disguise. The wedding was small and correct. The Hargreaves came, Sir Robert and his wife came. Lawton came from London and brought flowers, which Charlotte found unexpectedly charming. Lady Agatha wore grey silk and sat in the front pew and did not cry, which everyone present understood was her version of crying. Charlotte wore her best dress, which was her only remaining good dress, and Sebastian had given her his mother's pearls, which she wore without being asked because she understood exactly what they meant and intended to mean it back. She was 24 years old. She was the Duchess of Rolleston. She was standing in a cold stone church in Kent in December with her hand in the hand of a man who had called her by her name one afternoon in a corridor and changed the weather of her life. She said "I do" in the clear, carrying voice of a woman who had been reading aloud for years and knew how to mean a sentence. April 1815. The library at Rolleston Park in April was a different room than the library in October. In October it had been grey at the windows, and the fire had been necessary, and the light had come in at the low investigative angle of a season asking questions. In April the light simply arrived, without argument, and lay across the floorboards in long, warm bars, and the garden beyond the window was making its first serious claims on the year. The tulips in the urns had replaced the not-quite seasonal flowers of September with something that had earned its place. Charlotte was at the reading table. She was not reading. She was going through the new steward's first quarterly report, Mr. Graves, appointed in January, who was competent and methodical, and had come with good references from a Hertfordshire estate, and who had looked on his first morning at Rolleston Park at the revised ledger system laid out for him by the Duchess, with an expression that combined professional admiration with the slight unease of a man being shown how his kitchen runs by someone who clearly knows it better than he does. Charlotte had spent the preceding months working through the estate accounts with the systematic attention she had previously applied to detecting the fraud and now applied to preventing the conditions that had made it possible. She had standardized the lease recording system. She had introduced a secondary verification for any disbursement above £50, such that 2 signatures were required and the logic of the payment described in plain terms beside the figure. She had written to the Pembury Mill directly in February, reviewed the terms of the water rights lease, and renegotiated them at a rate 1/5 higher than the original, because she had examined what the mill was producing and what the water access was worth, and had found the original figure represented a generosity the estate had never deliberately extended. Sebastian had read the revised lease and looked at her for a long moment and said, 1/5 higher. The original rate was low, she said. The mill has prospered considerably since the lease was first drawn. It was a reasonable correction. You might have mentioned you were doing this. I mentioned I was corresponding with the mill's agent, she said. You mentioned it as an afterthought, while I was reading something else. You said "Ma," she agreed. He had taken a very specific kind of revenge for this in the study that evening, which had involved no correspondence whatsoever, and which Charlotte had found entirely satisfactory. She set down the steward's report now, and pressed her fingers briefly against the side of her waist, where the new fullness was not yet visible through the morning dress she wore, but was present, known, 3 weeks confirmed by the doctor, and considerably longer confirmed by Charlotte herself, who had noticed the change in her own body, with the same precise attention she brought to everything, and had sat with the knowledge for 10 quiet days before she was ready to name it aloud. She had told Sebastian on a Tuesday evening in the library. He had been at the writing table. She had come in and stood beside him and said, "I have something to tell you," and he had set his pen down immediately and looked at her with the full, unguarded attention she had learned to expect and still found each time, like a hand extended across a room. She had told him. He had stood up and held her face in both hands, the same gesture, the same careful deliberateness, and had said nothing for a full minute, and she had let the silence be what it was. "September," she had said eventually, doing the arithmetic aloud. "If my calculations are correct." "Are your calculations ever incorrect?" he had asked, and she had said, "Occasionally when I am working from insufficient data," and he had laughed against her hair and held her closer, and the library had been the warmest room she had ever stood in. She heard him now on the stairs. She had learned his step, the particular weight of it, the slight pause on the 3rd stair from the top where the board was loose, and he stepped around it every time, having learned to step around it without thinking, because that was what it meant to live somewhere long enough to know its specific flaws and accommodate them without remark. He came in carrying 2 letters, and the look of a man who had been outside and had recently decided the inside was preferable. His coat was damp at the shoulders. He had been walking the north field, which she knew because he had mentioned it at breakfast, and which the state of his coat confirmed. "Graves has flagged the fence repair on the eastern boundary," she said before he could speak. It's in the quarterly report. The cost is reasonable and the timing is correct for spring. He stopped. He looked at her. He set the letters on the table. I was going to tell you the fence needed repairing. I know, she said. You read the report before I'd seen it. Graves left it yesterday evening. She picked up her pen. The fence is straightforward. What are the letters? He sat down in his chair, the chair by the fire that had been his first and was now equally hers, a situation neither of them had formally arranged, and neither would change, and opened the first letter with the easy, unhurried motion of a man who is at home in his own rooms. The first is from Lawton, he said. He wishes to know when we will be in London for the season. The season begins in April, Charlotte said. We are in April. He is being polite. He means, are you well enough to travel? Charlotte considered this. She was 4 months along in good health, and the journey to London was half a day by good road. She was also not particularly interested in the season, which she had never attended as anything other than an observer, and which she suspected would prove somewhat different now that she arrived at it as a duchess, with a known history of solving problems that dukes had preferred to close. Tell him we will come for a fortnight in May, she said, after the fence is repaired. Sebastian looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. After the fence. The fence has practical consequence, she said. The season has largely social consequence. The order of priority seems clear. He wrote the reply. She returned to the steward's report. For a while the library held only the sounds it had always held. Rain beginning at the windows, the scratch of a pen, the fire. The comfortable, occupied silence of two people who had learned to be in the same room without requiring it to mean anything beyond what it was. What are you working out? He asked. She looked up. He was watching her with the old familiar attention. The question he had learned to ask, the question that meant, I am asking because I want to know. The Northfield grazing lease, she said. The rate has not been revised in 11 years. I've looked at the tenants' yields for the past 3 seasons. A 15% increase is sustainable and overdue. He was quiet for a moment. You worked that out before I asked. I worked it out on the carriage ride back from the Fenwicks last Tuesday, she said. I have been waiting for a reasonable moment to raise it. Charlotte. He said it in the tone she knew, not the tone of the corridor in October. That one had been the first time, deliberate and weighted. This one was its domestic descendant, quieter, certain of itself, entirely without performance. Yes, she said. You don't have to wait for a reasonable moment, he said. You may simply say the thing. She looked at him steadily. I know, she said. I'm still learning to believe it. He rose from his chair. He crossed to hers, the reading table, the spring light across the floor, the quarterly report between them, and he sat on the edge of the table beside her and looked down at her with the look that was only ever for her, and said, Believe it. She reached up and took his hand. He held it, his thumb tracing once across her knuckles, in the particular way that meant nothing in particular and everything in practice. Outside, the garden continued its slow, certain argument with the season, and the tulips in the urns stood straight, and the oaks along the drive were in their first bright green, and Ralston Park in April was not the same as Ralston Park in September, because nothing that has been properly lived in stays the same. She turned back to the quarterly report. He stayed at the edge of the table with her hand in his, and watched her think, which was, as he had told her once in a carriage in November, one of the things he intended to do for the remainder of his life. He found it, as he had found it every time since October, to be exactly what he had said it was. In September 1815, on a Tuesday morning, the child was born in the room down the corridor. Sebastian sat outside the door for 4 hours. Lady Agatha, who had remained at Ralston Park on the grounds that she was too old to be sent away and too stubborn to go, sat with him for the first hour, and then declared the corridor too draughty for her bones, and retreated to the drawing-room where she read Thucydides, with the steady, unhurried attention of a woman who has decided to occupy herself rather than endure. When the door opened and the nurse told him he could come in, Sebastian entered the room with the expression Lady Agatha would later describe, with great satisfaction, and to anyone who would listen, as entirely ridiculous. Charlotte was sitting up in the bed. She was tired in the particular, absolute way of someone who has accomplished something enormous and is still in the room where it happened. In the crook of her arm was a small, certain person who was looking at the middle distance with the focused, preliminary expression of someone who has just arrived and is already taking stock. Sebastian sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at them both. He did not say anything for a long moment. "A girl," Charlotte said. "Yes." He looked at the child. The The child looked at the middle distance. She has your expression. She has been in the world for 40 minutes, Charlotte said. She cannot have developed an expression yet. She has, he said. She is already working something out. Charlotte looked down at the small, serious face. She looked at Sebastian. She looked at the window, where the September light was coming in at the low, honest angle of a season that knew exactly what it was. She will need a name, Charlotte said. Yes. I have been thinking about it. He looked at her. Of course you have. Since approximately the carriage ride from the Fenwicks in March, she said. When I first calculated the date. He laughed, the real laugh, the one that came from somewhere genuine, and she felt it as she always felt it, like the resolution of a long and difficult equation. Tell me, he said. She told him. He said it was right. It was.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.